So the new topics that we are going to see today are the guiding process. So there is a somewhat of an analogy with flight, in the sense of there are three, I have divided it into three phases. One is the taking off, the second is the cruising, and the third is the landing. So it's useful to think of it using this analogy in order to position what activities you want to do for a student at a particular point of time. So to begin with, let's think about this question. You have identified your own research position and goals for a student. This was done in the previous day. Assume that you've also got a student who is aligned with your position and your goals. So now the question becomes, what next? What do I do next after this? So once again, we will go to Mentimeter and look at some options. So what you have to do is to rate these options, which is your first option, which is your second, which is the third thing that you will prioritize, and so on. So you can take a minute to do this activity. Okay, there are about 30 people have answered. So let's look at how the rating is. Yeah, so these responses seem to have stabilized, and most people are saying that the first priority is to get to know the student more, their prior knowledge and skills. So that's a very good point, because that is what is going to start off your interaction. And the second option has turned out to be make the student build background knowledge, concepts and skills. The third priority is setting up of a regular meeting. The fourth one is starting off on the research problem. And the fifth one is letting the student figure out the next steps. So it turns out that these are also aligned with my own responses. However, what is important to keep in mind is that there is no single correct answer here. Okay, so we have talked about what the responses are, but we must also keep in mind that it depends on guide to guide and student to student. Okay, so getting started with a PhD student, what is it that we need to look at? So as I mentioned, there is no single correct answers. We have to try different options in the initial few weeks and choose whatever works for that student. So once again, guide student alignment is important, and I am glad to note that most of you have said that you will get to know the student better as one of the first things. So the point to keep in mind here is that the guide may have a template that has worked before, but it may or may not work for the current student. So the guide also has to be flexible to modify the template that has worked for other students. So the key recommendation at this point is to let the student know why you are suggesting some action, and not just what the student should do. Often as guides, the why is implicit in our minds, and we only convey the what to the student, and sometimes the how. So what is important is for the student to know why you are making some suggestion. That actually brings them also into the participation of making the decision, and they are able to better work if they know these reasons. So letting the student participate in the decision making is again something that I would recommend as a good strategy to follow. Okay, so to look at an example, how do I get started with a student? So I ask a lot of seemingly irrelevant questions like, what do you like to do? What have you done that you have found interesting? What do you want to become? What's your background? So why do I ask these questions? It's because it helps me to determine what drives them, like what you all also said, that I need to get to know the student better. Okay, so it helps me to determine what drives them, what they are passionate about, what is their skill level, what is their ambition and their motivation. It also helps me to evaluate potential thesis directions that might suit the student. Okay, remember that my position is a highly flexible research agenda. So I do look for thesis directions that align strongly with what the student wants to become, what their ambition is, and so on. So here again, the recommendation is to get to know your students as persons, beyond entities in an academic setting. So if you know what drives them, you will be able to guide them better. Okay. So one more example of what do I do upon starting off with a student. Okay, so now there are some do's and don'ts that I follow. You are welcome to adopt the ones that make sense to you. So I spend a lot of time thinking on my own about the topic, because often it's a new topic for me also, since it might be a slightly different area. So I try to see what could be the research that the student can do on that topic. I also maintain my own detailed notes on where I think that the PhD can go. And I include alternate directions and branching and backtracking points. It's basically a planning document which as a guide I create and keep as a guideline for directing the student. Okay. So I consider the student's strengths and weaknesses and factor it into the plan. What I don't do is to wait for the student to initiate discussions. And I don't rely on the student's notes to accurately reflect the discussion. So I'll come to why this is so in a moment. I also don't expect my memory to be accurate and detailed after a few months. So this notes is a big deal for me. Okay, so why do I have my own notes? Often the exact words that you use while planning an approach or while writing a paragraph in a paper are important for recall. And a student in the initial years may write what you are saying in their own words, which may not work for you later. So they will translate or they will paraphrase what you are saying in terms of their own understanding, which may be different from what you intended to mean. Okay, many of them do audio recordings, but you don't want to listen to yourself again and again each time you want to go back to what you have done, what you have said. And a summary of the audio recording using some tool also may or may not work. So it often does not work for me. And you want to keep everything in one place to backtrack the thought process. In case if you have gone down a dead end sometime, you want to know where to go back up to so that you can take a different path. Okay. So earlier I used to share these plans gradually with the student as they mature. Okay. Later, nowadays, I find that it's easier to share it with the student as I am planning. So I just grab the student's notebook and write in it. And many of you may find that this is a very common practice taken by advisors. So here again the point is, maintain your own planning notes for the student's research work in whatever form that works for you. So it's not the form that matters, but the content of your planning that matters. Okay, so now let's come to the concerns in the initial stage. Okay, so you have got a student and you have got started with the student. Now the question is, what should be your concerns at this stage? So once again we will go to Mentimeter and go on to the next activity. What would be your concerns in the initial stage of your student's PhD? You can take a minute to rate these ideas. Some 35 people have responded, so we can take a look at these responses. Okay, so the responses seem to have stabilized. So here again we see that most people are saying, looking at the point of, have we built enough background? In the initial stage of your student's PhD, you have to worry about, have we built enough background? The second important one seems to be, are we going in the right direction? The third is, where is the novelty in the work? The fourth is the student working hard enough? And the fifth option is, what is the publication plan? So once again, this rating happens to align with my own, the order that I would have picked. However, the point to keep in mind here is that different people may have different ratings. So what you have to do is know that there is no single correct answer and choose a sequence or choose a priority that works for you and your student. Okay. So now coming to what are my main concerns at the initial stage. Why am I talking about my concerns? That's one data point for you to make your own plan. So I am not saying this as an authoritative way of doing something, but it is my way of doing things which I am sharing with you. Okay. So in the initial year, so initial could be 1 year or it could be 2 years, depending upon the duration of the PhD. So the main thing that I worry about is, are we running in the right direction? Have we found a suitable problem? This again comes because of my position, which is of being highly flexible research agenda. So it is important to determine, have we found a suitable problem? Because neither of us may be a real expert in the area. So the second question that I worry about is, have we built enough background? Have we done due diligence to related work? Or are we just running away on our own idea? So it's very important, because in the beginning years sometimes students are so focused on their idea that they fail to look at what all has been done by others, and later on it leads to trouble in terms of positioning that idea with respect to related work. So this, as we call the gap analysis, is a very important step in this initial period. Then the question is, have we learned the necessary skills and tools to solve the problem? So here again, different students may need to pick up different skills because they are working on varied problems. So how have other people approached this? What are the techniques that they are using in that area? Have we learned those skills? So all of these are concerns at this time. And then there is the question of, will the solution lead to something novel? And will it lead to something substantial? Both of these are important. There has to be some novelty, because that is what furthers the research in the field, and it has to be substantial because that is what makes it worthy of a PhD. So questions that I worry about here are, how to provide opportunities for the student to get familiar with the research. Maybe go to a conference with a, doctoral consortium paper or a poster, so that they can meet other people in that area. And I also look at, has the student done some minor projects other than the proposed thesis. So the reason for doing this is to ensure that they are building some research competence as they go along. Okay. So sometimes these minor projects themselves turn out to be big enough for a thesis. So the recommendation here is to let the student explore their interests within the agreed scope, and not to worry too much about how the explorations will fit into their thesis at this stage. So once again, this is my position. So if you are on a different point of the continuum, you may have a different take on what is to be done in the initial year. Okay. Now let me tell you some stories. So one student had a keen interest in photography and visuals. Okay. So initially there was some floundering, because what we were trying to do was to leverage this interest and this skill to making a thesis. Okay. So we were exploring teaching learning of graphicacy, how do students understand graphs, how can we use photography to teach it, and all kinds of interesting avenues we went down. Okay. Many of them turned out to be too difficult to attempt within the scope of a PhD, some of them turned out to be dead ends, but we had great fun. Okay. Finally, the thesis became about building a tool for visual learning analytics of educational data. Okay, so after 2 years, the student did manage to converge and graduate on time. Another student had a keen interest in CS education, but we were in the education technology department. So 1 year we spent trying to generalize, on looking at how to teach logic. Another year was spent exploring how to teach research methods, That too involves a lot of logic. Okay. So at some point we said, look, this is not working going into these broader areas. So we went back to CS education, and the thesis became one on teaching learning of software design verification. So in this case again, the question may be asked that, why is this a thesis in education technology and not a thesis in computer science? Okay, so the reason here is, from the education technology perspective, there is a lot of emphasis on the pedagogy of the teaching learning system that the student built. Okay, so the reason why I am talking about this is that many students may do an interdisciplinary thesis. So as guides, it is important for us to keep in mind how the thesis fits into a particular discipline. The third student had a keen interest in tinkering. So the initial years went into exploring, design, how do people do design, what are maker spaces, what are courses that are being offered on maker spaces, what's the pedagogy that is followed, and so on. Okay. Finally, the thesis became about nurturing tinkering in engineering design. So here again, while the initial goal was to ensure that students learn tinkering, we realized as we went along that nurturing tinkering is a more appropriate goal. So a lot of careful positioning is required. Okay. So the point here in the initial stage is that it's okay to take some time, and any learning is useful for the student in one way or the other. It's not necessary that all the things that the student do has to go towards their thesis and they should not deviate. So I personally do not subscribe to that philosophy. So for example, the student who spent time on how to teach logic, etc., was able to apply the same learning in building their system. So a lot of these learning which the student gathers in the initial years by exploration comes into play one way or the other. Most of it does. Okay. So now here is a slightly longer activity. This is to come up with your own plan for a PhD student. Now as you know, these longer activities are actually what will constitute the assignment. So today's assignment has 3 such activities which you can get started off on right away. So this activity is to think about your own area of research interest and assume that you have a PhD student who's aligned with your research agenda. So now consider what all we have discussed so far and come up with a tentative plan for the student's first year. So what will be useful here is if you can write in very specific terms with respect to your own research. Like which exact journals are you going to ask the student to browse, what research group will they look at, what are the canonical papers that you want the student to read. So all of these will actually be very useful even for you once you have the student. So this needs to be submitted as part of assignment 2, and now that you have seen that there is a lot of value in peer learning, you may share your answers in the class responses document. So I'll just put the link to that document in the chat. So you can have 5 minutes to do this activity.